To go ahead and get started. My name is Elizabeth Gomez. I'm one of the marketing associates here at Netrix. I wanted to introduce Jay Parekh, who is the director of the legal vertical, and Chris Clark, our speaker, who is the senior solution architect and team lead for Modern Workplace. I will let them take it from here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. My name is Jay Parekh. I'm one of our partners and director here at Netrix. I run our legal vertical practice. We currently work with over 60 law firms across the United States and various different types of projects, including some of the things that we'll be talking about today in the next hour. Chris, can you advance slide, please, to the Netrix overview? So Netrix overall, at a high level, we're about 500 employees based out of the Chicagoland area with in Europe and Asia. We specialize in all things Microsoft, as well as many other things that we can discuss at a later point. Today's topic we're going to cover is the Microsoft Enterprise Mobility and Security Stack and how you could use that to protect your users and mostly your attorneys to protect data leakage from multi-factor authentication to DLP and Azure information protection. Chris Clark will run through all the different options you have today, and most of the tools we're finding out most of the firms already own because of their Microsoft licensing agreement through the EMS E3 or E5 or the M365 E3 or E5. Post this webinar, if there's questions, we'll be able to answer it, and also a recording will be sent with follow-up after this call as well. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Chris Clark to run through this webinar, and if there's questions, please wait until the end, and we'll answer as much as we can. Thank you so much.
Morning or afternoon, everyone. I'll quickly go over our agenda for today. So just briefly on our Netrix overview there, but we also want to start off looking at Microsoft security, have a kind of high-level overview and understand the products that Jay was mentioning, but also the interaction between all the different capabilities around security. Then we'll deep dive into information protection specifically. We'll have demos throughout each of the various topics. And then at the end, again, we can open up for questions. Out and thinking about Microsoft security, we have a few kind of alarming statistics that really help set the stage for what might be important in law firms today, or really any organization. One of these kind of sobering statistics here is 81% of breaches are due to stolen or weak passwords. So there's kind of a saying out there in security that the only individuals that love passwords are hackers. And the reason for that is users don't like them, right? There's social engineering. There's how many passwords can you actually remember as a user? Are you using something that is easily guessable at the same time? We get into things that are very interesting, and one of the top questions pose to clients when talking about security, and at least around passwords, is something along the lines of saying, you know, what's one of the most easily guessable passwords right now that still meets your Active Directory AD security requirements around passwords? So uppercase, lowercase, number, symbol. You have 3 out of the 4. You might have a number of characters, but it has to do with seasons. So winter's coming here very soon, at least in the Chicagoland area first. But one of those passwords could be winter 29 exclamation mark with a capital W. So you look in a large organization or even a mid-sized organization, whatever it may be, or any organization for that matter, how many users in your environment possibly have that password? Because one, it's easy to remember. It's associated with something that changes every so often, and we can see how the password really becomes one of the -- problems overall. So there's a lot of technologies around Microsoft 365 that can really help with this that we'll dive deep into. But something is being able to simply block some unique password like that. It's a feature of what's called Azure AD Identity password protection. And this allows you to actually enable a proxy system to Microsoft where when the user changes their password, it actually will check against a dictionary provided by Microsoft and then your own custom dictionary where you could add your organization name, 2019 exclamation mark, whatever it may be that you think could be easily guessable within your environment. So important pieces here is that the password is one of the weakest links, but we'll see that we have controls like conditional access, multi-factor authentication, even going passwordless ultimately will help us tackle this sobering statistic here. So a secondary item here is thinking about what's called shadow IT. We have users in an organization, you have attorneys, faculty, and staff that are using enterprise applications, right? They might be on premises in the traditional sense, but most likely almost all organizations have cloud applications, including Office 365 in this case. These could be a number of cloud applications in your environment, ones that you're aware of, ones that you're not, or the shadow IT side. But if you look at an average large enterprise, you have over 1,000 apps that users are using, be it if they're sanctioned apps or unsanctioned apps. So generally users are going to use what they need to use in order to get their job done, which is very scary for security. So do you have control over any of these apps? Do you have visibility into the data within these apps or even the identity around these applications as well? So in particular around data, 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. So data sprawl and the ability to have these cloud apps, even something like OneDrive, which is more of a personal drive, on the business side is almost unlimited storage, right? Very scary. How do we have controls around that? What controls do we have? But data is exploding essentially. When we look at these items, they're kind of pillars of identity, data protection, device protection. You have all sorts of different security products. And really what Microsoft has designed Microsoft 365 to do is to create this cohesiveness between all the products. So if you have identity controls, they match up with data protection controls. You have visibility into cloud apps, and they all work together. So typically, you might have over 70 security products within a typical environment and 35 different vendors. So you're managing 35 different vendors, different products, different skill sets, different resources in your organization, and everything that goes along with that. So we can see why so much is spent on security, possible just false alerts, tracking down alerts, understanding the security operations component, and how can we, one, automate that, get better insights, and then ultimately just have really more automation around everything as opposed to sifting through millions of alerts from various different systems. So what goes along with that as well is thinking about cybersecurity in general, one of the #1 topics right now. Looking at the resources that are available, there's very minimal out in the environment right now. So one of the #1 probably jobs you can want to go for, but the flip side of that for law firms is how do we find resources that can cover these capabilities? So a lot of items to think about, but ultimately what we come to the conclusion of is this best of breed for security model is essentially broken. So we don't necessarily look at the Gartner quadrant for every single aspect of security, make sure we have #1 here, #1 there, #1 there. And those 37 solutions are all the best solutions, right? Considered by some reporting aspect. But how do they work together, right? They're complex, they're expensive. There might not be any integration at all whatsoever. Training goes along with that, resources like we mentioned, too many alerts, and then ultimately gated visibility, right? So everything is kind of compounded, too many alerts, where's the focus at? And that's really what Microsoft 365 security is designed to tackle in this case. So Microsoft 365 security, we have these high-level pillars. And what we're ultimately looking at is kind of from a 10,000 foot level view, right? We're not going to say that information protection or something like we'll see is Azure information protection could be the answer to everything. But what about identity? So you have identity out through Office 365. You have it in other cloud applications. Are they possibly integrated? But the main pillar here in thinking about that, identity and access management. We also have information protection that we'll be focusing on. But what about threat protection, mobile devices, endpoint protection, high-level threat capabilities? So each one is essentially a piece to the puzzle. But as you see throughout all the cloud applications that we were talking about, these are all components that you would focus on for really almost any connection. What we'll see later is essentially identity becomes this new control plane, and that can also balance out with your information protection policies to go along with your identity controls, and then even endpoint and threat and mobile device management. One large advantage that Microsoft has is what's called the Intelligent Security Graph. Ultimately is just up to 6.5 trillion signals per day, which is just a massive amount of data that's brought into the Microsoft security intelligence. So Microsoft has over 3,000 plus security professionals just dedicated to security. They're investing over $1 billion a year in security solutions and creating this cohesiveness, just like Microsoft 365 is. But these signals really come from Office 365. They come from consumer services like Outlook.com, Hotmail, Xbox on that side. So all the Windows 10 PCs that are out in the world essentially are all bringing signals back to Microsoft to see what are the current threats. You know, what's shaping that some malware threat or some type of malicious component within Windows 10 wasn't known, you know, even a month ago, and all of a sudden they're seeing the signals from all these different components of the intelligent security graph. Now that can be brought into all sorts of various products that we'll see, like cloud app security, or the way conditional access is defined, or maybe even something like endpoint protection with Defender ATP. So it's really this better together story, but ultimately we need to really look at the kind of the pillar components, right? So the explosion of apps, devices, we're not necessarily inside in the castle with the moat around it and the drawbridge and the alligators around it. It's on-prem, it's in the cloud, there's hybrid components to that. There's also shadow IT that you don't have visibility into. So it's no longer thinking about kind of the legacy components, but how it's really expanded, and that's really reality now. So we have devices everywhere. We really think about platforms is a good way to look at it. So iOS, Android, Mac, PC. We want to cover everything, right? Everything is a possible endpoint and a possible threat. So we need controls around each of these connections. So looking at identity controls, do we have visibility into identity controls as well? So maybe not just static policies, but are there risky users our environment based on certain parameters? So maybe we want to have separate policies around those to flat out block access if they're deemed risky. So that could be items like leaked credentials, maybe a botnet's trying to connect Office 365 or another cloud app. That would actually trigger what we'll see under conditional access as a risk-based event. So really thinking about any regulations that need to be taken into account, right, around data protection, but also ultimately we need to balance security and productivity. So Microsoft's ultimate goal is, you know, to make every user in the world productive with their products, but then at the same time, how does security come in? So if we can make it easy for the user, seamless, then that will meet those parameters. So when looking at these pillars, what we kind of come to the realization of is that identity has become this new control plane. And we talked about the various areas that applications could lie. So we still have on-premises. That's not going away. We're not saying everything's migrating to the cloud, right, just yet. So you have more of hybrid environment that you have to really be aware of. So we have the cloud apps like Office 365, but other cloud apps like Workday, Salesforce. We'll see what the top 15 are that Microsoft sees that are integrated with Azure AD here in just a little bit. But these could be thousands of other cloud apps that you can bring into this single pane of identity. Now, we also have partners and customers. So a consultant like myself at Netrix, I need to access multiple clients to work with them on implementing, Microsoft 365 or whatever type of engagement I'm on. I'm considered that partner or consultant side. So how do you gain visibility into what I'm doing? Do you have identity controls like MFA around my account? And now it's just another point of entry, essentially, that understand and have controls around. So not only employees, partners, and customers, but then devices again, like we mentioned. So not just the standard, PC, Mac, Windows, iOS, and Android, but also, IoT. You have almost every type of device that you can imagine that's connected now. So including your refrigerator, basically. So very, very interesting, but also very alarming. Can we have controls? Can we have visibility? Are these devices even connecting to our resources? Identity becomes that large piece of the puzzle to help with data protection as well. If you have data protection, possibly, and you're not using anything like encryption, if you have stolen identity or breached credentials, then you could just get into these systems and download data and do malicious things, right? Like data exfiltration. So we really need a high level approach to it, but again, there's not one silver bullet to everything that we're talking about. Single identity control plane really means is that you want to provide seamless access to these apps that the users are using, and maybe even have data protection controls around data that could leak out to those shadow IT apps. So an example of that would be if I use something like Azure Information Protection, or what we'll see is unified labeling, and I label the document as confidential. Only users in my organization can actually open that document based on authentication to the information protection service. So even though I took that document and uploaded it to Dropbox or OneDrive Personal, or put it on a USB drive and accidentally lost it, there's no way anyone could open that unless they're an active user in your tenant. So very powerful stuff, but you start to really see, even if you didn't have visibility into those apps, how could you still control the data that could leak out to them? So part of that would be creating single sign-on for as many cloud apps as possible with something like Azure AD, because then you can have the conditional access controls around that. So you have that identity plane, but we also want to automate those components around IDM or provisioning and have, from the onboarding process straight through to provisioning within these cloud apps is all seamlessly automated. There's also a component of self-service. We briefly talked about multi-factor authentication. Users have to actively go and register their device, right? So if I'm using a Microsoft Authenticator on my phone, or I want to use a text message, or maybe we'll see that there's hardware tokens, users can actively go out and register. More of a user communications and adoption process that really needs to be taken into account, especially around information protection, since it's so new. We'll see, what the user experience looks like. And what I've found as a consultant working with something like AIP is that it becomes, maybe 80% design, and the technical pieces are minimal, and the rest is communication as well. So very easy to implement, not as easy to implement effectively with your user base without having, vetted pilots, communications, going through different waves of adapting to, the type of feedback you'll get from the users, because as the technical side, you can only guess so many scenarios around information protection, but it's amazing what your users will come up with in something like a pilot or those test phases. A lot of self-service components, being able to request to add yourself to an application. So maybe you're in marketing, you didn't have access to Salesforce for some reason, and you want to have access to that. You can actually request access with self-service app management and self-service group management. And then also even something like self-service password reset. So a lot of great self-service capabilities that we can focus on once we have that single identity as that control plane. So the seamless access to apps we mostly covered, but thinking about the cloud side of things, but also on-prem as well. So we have other capabilities to take some legacy web applications that might not even have been designed to be available external, and then allow them to have external access without opening up firewall ports, as an example. So we can use something like an Azure AD app proxy within the single sign-on within Azure AD and bring in internal IIS web app, internal SharePoint app where you still have data on-prem, and then have the same controls that we'll see in conditional access around these apps at the same time. So not only cloud, but on-prem and everything in between as far as a hybrid environment would go. Statistics on what Microsoft has seen as far as the most used cloud apps within Azure AD is, about more than a year old now. I'd say it's probably similar to what we see as far as the types of apps we're integrating at clients in various engagements. ServiceNow, Salesforce, Workday, definitely one of the top ones that I see all the time. But then you can see there's 810,000 active apps integrated with Azure Active Directory at this point. So I would say based on at least even the engagements we're doing, that's probably doubled by now for an updated slide and statistics. So growing very fast, but there's 1,000+ apps in a gallery that are predefined that have even custom walkthroughs in order how to integrate them. You're guaranteed to work with Azure AD, but you can ultimately have any SAML application integrated into Azure AD with single sign-on, and then have all the various controls that we want, access and identity, and even information protection at the same time. So 20 million active users throughout Azure AD single sign-on. What we're ultimately looking to get to is what's called a zero trust approach. Don't want to inherently trust any connection. We need some type of controls around every connection to Office 365, to these cloud apps. Otherwise, prevent an attacker from signing in and sending phishing emails, right? Also, exfiltrating data like we mentioned in those scenarios. Not only an attacker, but also your employees. So what type of protection mechanisms do you have around your employees on, say, a home PC versus a domain PC in the traditional sense, or a trusted corporate asset? We need to look at 3 high-level pillars here of secure authentication. So we lead into what's called modern authentication. We want to get away from what's called basic protocols and ultimately block them, because they can get around to the policies we're trying to implement. So these are items like SMTP, POP, IMAP. They're controls that don't understand what's called conditional access. And ultimately, again, we need to block them. So conditional access, we'll see here in detail in a second, has a ton of capabilities. So basically it's saying, if this happens, then do this. So the if this happens is that zero trust approach. So it's saying, where is the user coming from? What type of device are they using? What's their risk level? Are they in a trusted location? Which user is it if it's part of a group? And what app are they accessing? So we have really finite capabilities around targeting users and scenarios, or you can have a blanket policy for your entire environment. So highly customizable. And then something like Azure AD Identity Protection, which is part of EMS E5 or Microsoft 365 E5, will give you that risk-based conditional access capability. So being able to detect if there's leaked credentials or known leaked credentials that Microsoft's aware of on the dark web or paste bins. Something like an anonymous browser, which your normal user shouldn't be using. So does that become a higher risk scenario? And then if so, what's the policy around that? So what goes along with zero trust typically is that implementing MFA. So as a consultant now, I would say that you have to implement MFA regardless, right? As one of the first controls. There's almost no reason not to. And the way the attacks are happening from any type of device, even including Macs that we see, right, in the sign-in logs. There's basic auth attacks from a Mac, you know, as a phishing example. It wasn't really thought of, you know, thinking you have your endpoint controls or maybe you have DLP type of identity controls do you have around all those different aspects that we talked about. So implementing MFA prevents, you know, 99% plus of the attacks, and then the other controls that we're talking about will really help set the stage, right? Not nothing's going to be 100% effective, the type of visibility that you'll have, and then just implementing MFA are huge steps in any law firm or organization. So I mentioned some of the capabilities around MFA, having a push notification, simple as it popping up on your phone as you see there, or even on an Apple Watch like I have. I just see the notification on it and I hit approve and I'm into a website or whatever resource it may be. Text message, phone call, there's new OAuth capabilities. So you can have hardware tokens for users that don't necessarily want to use their personal phone or whatever the scenario may be. I've worked with other countries that have specific regulations that have to use hardware tokens. So good examples of those, but you have really the capability around you know, the user choosing what works for them or just meeting other regulations like hardware tokens, you know, on what those requirements are. Now, ultimately, Microsoft to go passwordless, right? We saw from the very beginning, passwords were essentially a problem in general, right? Only hackers like them. So what are the options around this? Windows Hello is a big part to this. So if you have any type of biometrics capable device, if we're talking about, let's say Windows 10 PCs in general, if you have a Surface Book or a Surface Pro, whatever it may be, you will have Windows Hello capabilities around facial recognition. You could have other devices with biometrics, but essentially Hello counts as that second factor, right? So the device itself, you as part of the biometrics become that second factor. So long story short with that is that we have this enabled in Netrix, and I think I've used my network password on my Surface Book, you know, once in a while. So generally I'm signing in with my facial recognition and everything is off and running. You can even use something as simple as a PIN if you don't have biometrics. But again, it's the second factor that now an attacker's not going to have, right? So unless, you know, you're kidnapped and they have your phone or your device, which is a whole other story of targeting, then generally that's where that 99% comes from, right? So very powerful, something we want to implement regardless is what we recommend. So what all this has really led to is just understanding what conditional access is and what the capabilities are. From a very high level. So we have what I mentioned is if this happens, then do this. So with conditional access on the left here, we have our platform. So we can target iOS, Android, mobile devices are going to be different, right? Maybe we want to use Intune to protect the applications and the data on mobile devices. And on the Windows side, maybe we want to say you only allow main PCs, or maybe you have what's considered on the right here more of a limited access scenario. So something that could block downloads or block printing, and you could still use the application in the web browser instead of being able to have full access to the data for an exfiltration scenario. So access is probably one of the most powerful concepts talking about. It also works with multiple products, as we can see here. So in order to have the visibility and control around the session, that's where something like Microsoft Cloud App Security will come in. So there's a lot of capabilities, including location-based, choosing the type of app that's connecting to these services. Are they on a trusted device? What type of authentication method are they using? We said modern auth, basic auth. So generally, we can define the connection with a static policy, or in the middle, we see here there's more of a session risk where we can actually, or Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph can judge the session risk and then enable a specific policy around that, as opposed to having a static policy. So very powerful controls, but this lines up exactly with what we were talking about around having zero trust as our overall approach. So I will switch out to the portal here in 1 second, and then we'll take a look at conditional access policies that I have set up as a great example, and then also really see what the end user experience looks like from that point of view in more of a session-based risk control capability. So within conditional access, the policies themselves are configured in Azure AD. So I'm in the main portal.azure.com, and I have a few demo policies here on the bottom that if you see the state over on the right, they're all enabled. So the bottom 4 are the main policies we're working with. So we have an overall policy, which is the third one here, which is require MFA or domain join PC, or even a compliant PC. So we talked about MFA as being one of the key controls. So if I click into this policy to just get an idea, we have everything that we saw on the left on that slide are these assignments. So this is when this happens, and then the access controls are do this. So when this happens is the users and groups, what app are they connecting to, and then the other various conditions. And then the access controls are grant, block, or maybe session-based controls. So if I dive deeper into this particular policy, one has created a trusted device model with this policy. So we say all users are going to register for MFA. MFA essentially as a backup, that zero trust control. Every connection, if it's a connection that's coming from a domain PC, which is actually represented in the middle there, it says require hybrid Azure AD join. It actually means domain PC that's registered in Azure. They'll have a seamless experience because the device itself is trusted. But if you go and connect on a non-domain PC, you're going to be challenged for MFA. This really provides the best of both worlds that we've seen. Instead of trying to do something like location-based MFA, we're able to really provide the usability versus security and provide the most seamless experience that we can. So compliant PCs is another option that could be enrolled into Intune or maybe Config Manager with co-management, and then also even around mobile devices as well for compliant. So again, we go to the device itself is trusted. So there's other controls around the device that deem it to be trusted, and now it counts as MFA. So is a great scenario, but when we think about data protection with this particular policy, I could be on a home PC, could be challenged for MFA. Now I have access to all your data in SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams. So what other controls do we have around that? And that's really where the session-based controls come in. So when I look at a different policy, and again, these all kind of work together. You can have multiple policies. but maybe I want to block download for Exchange Online and also prevent copy, paste, and print using these session controls. So the difference here is that when we click into the policy, we can see that the access controls here, we're not using any of the grant controls, but we're using the session controls. So what that means here, session controls are actually going to block downloads on policy. So instead of being more of a static policy, it's going to detect that I'm not on a trusted device based on the backend policy and then block downloads based on that. So what that ultimately means is if I'm not on a domain PC or a compliant PC, I'm going to block downloads from Exchange Online or Outlook web app. That's a built-in policy, and our kind of corresponding policy that also works with Exchange Online is going to be preventing copy and paste. Now we can see it says use custom policy for conditional access app control, and that's actually part of Microsoft Cloud App Security. So what this looks like from an end user perspective is I'm signed in with one of those targeted users into my Office 365 portal. You can see I have access to all my apps, but in particular, we have a conditional access policy just around Outlook. So before I signed in, I was challenged for MFA, our higher level policy. It knows I'm not on a domain PC or a trusted PC, and it was challenged for MFA. Now I'm in the portal, and if I want to click on Outlook, this represents OWA, or that connection to Exchange Online. If we see quickly, the URL up top actually redirects to what's called Microsoft Cloud App Security. So similar to outlook.office365.com, says .cas.ms. So all traffic is now being redirected to Microsoft Cloud App Security to interpret the session. So what that means is it detects I'm not on a home PC. I'm not on a trusted PC. I'm on more of a home PC scenario. If I look at an attachment here, I can view the attachment in the OWA itself, just like normal, but I'm not able to download the attachment, and I'm not actually able to copy and paste or even print, because now the entire session is being controlled by the session-based controls that we had. So that we can work within it, within the browser, I'm not able to download. So when I try and download, I'll see a message that you can customize based on the policy that you have set up in the back end of Cloud App Security. And now we're preventing the download. And it's actually just a text file basically saying the exact same thing. Now, instead of having just a policy that completely blocks home access and only allows domain PCs, we have a nice middle ground that goes along with the idea of data protection. Because now we're preventing downloads.
You know?
And we're
Really?
preventing
That's what they're trying to keep people off.
Copy and paste here as well. So you can see this is just a custom message. Again, you can customize. And even before I got into the app, we could have been warned that this is a monitored app. So that's an optional feature as well. So very powerful. This is an example of Exchange Online, but this could be for Teams, SharePoint Online, OneDrive. Now we really start to see this better together story, right? The multiple products working together, one that can take the session and interpret if it's on a domain PC or a compliant PC, and if it's not, then it's going to enforce different conditional access controls. Conditional access, again, very powerful, but we can see how that relates to information protection. Now we really want to switch back to really diving deep into the information protection capabilities specifically. I'm going to switch back here. Take a look at information protection. So kind of set the stage around identity, access management, capabilities, how that relates to information protection, specifically within enterprise mobility and security and Microsoft 365, have Azure information protection. There's also the higher level concept of just information protection overall. So we need to say, you know, one of the pillars here we're looking for is where is this information, right? The discovery capabilities. Where is your confidential information in your environment? Is it on premises? Is it already in other cloud apps? Is it in Office 365? Do you have visibility into that? And how can you find that information? So we'll see something like an AIP scanner can actually go and discover that information on file shares or SharePoint on-prem sites. So help please lend itself to thinking about your data classification taxonomy. So if you don't currently have a data classification policy, discovery can really help with that. So Microsoft recommends, you know, jumping right to discovery, understanding what's in your environment, and then maybe that will help shape what's called classifications here. So we can classify or label documents directly within the document itself. So the stays with the document no matter where it is. My earlier example of taking a document and having it labeled as confidential and not being able to open it will go directly with this. So we can classify or label documents, but we can also protect. So we don't have to jump directly to protection. We can classify and then later on enable protection based on the label. So the protection component is encryption that stays with the document, and the authorization of being an internal employee, as an example, as opposed to my Netrix account trying to open a document, I would be denied access in that case. So we also need to monitor these capabilities, and that's where that better together kind of cloud app security can monitor these data exfiltration components now that these apps are now tied into the session controls, and we have visibility into, you know, malicious actions like creating external forwarding rules in Outlook, or having anonymous links in SharePoint Online, or sharing data or mass downloads. So all these scenarios that really is what you're concerned about. You know, it's no longer necessarily just endpoint protection. Is what would an attacker do in your environment, and how do we have scenarios and visibility into those types of actions? So this is all across devices, apps that we've seen, different cloud services, and even on-prem. So the main questions that we start to ask, you know, ourselves when we're thinking about data protection are: do I have visibility to files on mobile devices? Do I have controls around those, maybe in the traditional MDM sense? But also, do you have high-level app protection capabilities, like something like Intune can offer around mobile devices specifically? Construct of mobile devices kind of goes away at the same time, right? We're really thinking about how do we protect every device. But we also talked about discovery. So the SaaS apps, right? Do we have visibility? Is data in there we're aware of? Is there shadow IT? How do I protect that sharing external capabilities? Do I have visibility into that as well? And then ultimately, how do I just protect data on all the different sides that we've been talking about? So we can quickly go over these for kind of sake of time, but really we're thinking about this ring here, not only on-prem, we have apps that we're aware of, but then there's other shadow IT apps that we are really out of our control. So ultimately, we can have as many apps as possible into single sign-on and have something like cloud app access control capabilities that we saw that give you that nice middle ground and the visibility into them, but there's always going to be shadow IT. So maybe ultimately something like Azure Information Protection is the answer to that. Now with AIP, we have the Information Protection Scanner, the AIP scanner I mentioned. So we have on-prem SharePoint or file servers. So these are scanners or multiple scanners you can set up in your environment, and they go and crawl your environment and look for Office 365 DLP. You can look for things like credit card information, payment card information, social security numbers, bank account, all various countries type of DLP depending on your environment, and report back in just audit mode if you want to. They even do have the capability to enforce labels if you have those set up as part of your overall setup as well. So, and classify, label, and protect automatically with the scanner on the on-prem side. And then something like Cloud App Security will be the same type of functionality on the cloud side. So not only SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams, but also other third-party cloud apps that would be integrated with Cloud App Security and Azure AD ultimately. The visibility component and the control component really involve thinking about both sides. Then we look at what the client experience looks like. So fairly new is the Office apps on mobile, so iOS or Android. They've always pretty much understood the sensitivity labels, but now you can actually label within the itself. So just last week, Outlook was added to this list instead of just Word, Excel, PowerPoint. And now you can label sensitivity labels directly on an iPad, like this example, or an Android phone. So confidential, sorry, the label and the protection stays with the document as we were talking about. So no matter if it's on a mobile device or on a different file repository, or wherever it may be, it's protected as long as you have those settings around that. Very easy to use on iOS and Android. And then at the same time, on the Mac side of things, if you have Macs in your environment, Mac for Office 2016 and above have the unified labeling or Azure Information Protection capabilities built in. So instead of having to have a separate client, it's actually built into the application itself. So it's fully aware of the labels that we'd be labeling within Microsoft Office on any platform that your users will be using. Just a few minutes left here, but just want to quickly go into a quick demo of what the end user experience looks like on information protection, so we can get a feel for that. Switch over screens here. Of information protection or Azure information protection, or what's called unified labeling now. Kind of two different areas where you configure them, but ultimately the user experience is going to be very similar. What we have is the classification bar that's in Office. So this is just a Word document. And again, these labels would follow your taxonomy that's existing already, or if you're coming up with it based on maybe the scanning component, like I mentioned. So completely customizable. These are just ours in our environment. We have non-business, public, general, confidential, highly confidential, and then one for demo purposes. So at a high level, you can easily label documents just by clicking on the sensitivity label, either here or the actual information classification bar there as well. So we have a concept of more of a high level category and sublabels, or it can just be the label itself. So an example of that would be highly confidential, could be all employees. Other sublabels for departments is the typical example we'll see. So marketing, legal, finance, whatever it may be, you're able to highly customize it. So only those groups of users could even use that label and or access documents with that label itself. We take this document itself and look at some of the other capabilities. Based on choosing the label, we'll have either watermarks, headers, footers that we can customize. So we have just an example that quickly here showing, here's an example watermark. We can change the color, the text, the font, the direction, multiple aspects around that. And then we also have the footer or header as well. So on just choosing the label, as far as the end user experience, we've now just defined it that it is sensitive HR information. Again, this is just a demo, but if it was something like highly confidential all employees, that would really mean all internal employees can only access this document. So if you were to look at a document that's already been labeled, we would see kind of a different experience here. We can see that we have the watermark, we have a header, we have a footer. Also, the view permissions bar is here, and you can see that EMS demo name of the document. We have view, edit, copy, print, save, export. So I have full permissions based on our current settings, but you can even limit permissions based on the user who is authenticating to this document. So this could represent read-only type of document scenario. You can even have automatically expire after a certain period of time. So we have a self-destruct capabilities, just like Mission Impossible. And then you have offline access capabilities. So do you want a user to be able to cache this, or do you want them to authenticate every single time they open the document? So very powerful. It's protection that stays with the document no matter where it is. It's built into Office, and then what we're going to see here very soon at Ignite, it's going to be built throughout all of Office 365 as well, including SharePoint Online, Teams, and OneDrive. So very powerful capabilities. Looking at all aspects of information protection, not even just AIP. We need to think about identity, devices that users are accessing them, the information on, then also the visibility you have into those apps that they're using. And then ultimately something like AIP would kind of complete the story of being able to actually protect the documents no matter where they were. So very high level controls, but ultimately looking for, one of the approaches for information protection at a high level. So I know we only have about 5 minutes left, so I did want to actually stop there, and we can open up for any questions that anyone might have. Wasn't tracking in case there were questions there. Anyone have any questions?
Looks like it.
Yeah. Doesn't sound like there's any questions, but appreciate everyone's time today.
Thank you, Chris. This is being recorded, so we will send a link out to the recording if you want to pass it along with the other folks on your team that couldn't make this webinar. My contact information will also be attached to the follow-up. So if there's additional information, you want to do deep dive on any of these solutions that Chris talked about today in the past hour, please feel free to reach out. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and have a good rest of the day.